Hello, everyone. In the SAP ERP system, there are two modules designed to perform the accounting functions, financial accounting and controlling. And the controlling is basically representing our managerial accounting functions. In the past 2 weeks, we have learned a few basic financial accounting modules, such as how to making journal entries, the procurement and sales related transactions, with a focus on how accounting is integrated with other business functions and how the general ledgers are automatically updated with the transactions, and how we can prepare financial statements in the end of the accounting cycle. For the controlling function, which is also very important, but I really don't have time to cover everything in class. So I will show you an optional module under the controlling function so you can get a feeling of the managerial accounting operations. And the example we are going to use is related how to allocate the internal cost among different departments. In particular, we'll simulate a process to allocate the cafeteria cost and the maintenance cost to the functions that receive those services. Before we get into the functions, let's review a few key cost concepts in managerial accounting. The first one is how to separate or differentiate the direct cost and indirect cost. When we introduce these two concepts in the introduction of managerial accounting, the focus is for direct cost. Those are the costs incurred and attributable to a cost object directly, such as the depreciation expenses or labor, utility, insurance expenses, so that are charged mostly by external entities of the business. And the cost object can be a business unit, a segment, a department, or a product or activities or functions. So it's depending on what's your interest to accumulate the cost. And in the SAP ERP, the direct costs are normally defined as primary cost elements. So primary cost elements, we have those ledger accounts directly under the financial accounting system. For example, we have the labor expense as the chart of the account, and also miscellaneous expense. And remember, we use the rental expenses in the financial accounting module for the property renting we have. So to understand directly, so each cost object, they will have their own direct cost, and most of these direct cost represents by each of the chart of the accounts. Okay, so the different expense account. And in comparison, we have indirect cost. Indirect costs are not a cost directly occurred for this cost object. It's normally allocated from other departments or other services to a cost object because this cost object use their services. So such as the general IT services, repairment expenses, or cafeteria cost, right? So incurred in the cost object, but allocated to all other functions or departments receiving the services. So for cost center, which is the concept we use for responsibility accounting. So I think sometimes it's not exactly equal, but you can understand a cost center is like a cost object. So defined by the company, what are the cost objects I want to track and accumulate the cost, and with the controlling and monitoring purpose. So for the cost center, which is a very important structure under the SAP, the cost center is represent the business units, segments, or activities that are responsible for the cost incurred to their operations. So in this way, it's very similar to the definition of a cost object. And all of the costs accumulated to a cost center will include their own direct cost, plus any allocated cost from other departments or functions. And these indirect allocated costs, they are defined as secondary. So we can say the secondary cost elements in the SAP, so is accumulate or track all of the costs for this cost center. So the primary cost, so sometimes they explain the primary cost elements takes care of the cost movement between the financial accounting and managerial accounting. But the secondary cost elements only take care of the cost movement among the managerial accounting modules, so allocation between different departments. And these accounts are not directly related to a ledger account. Okay, they don't really represent using labor expense or utility expense. Is more related to a cost object or cost center. We'll say the total cost for the cafeteria or the total cost for the maintenance department. So rather than we are breaking down into the real expense types. Oh, this is something I think so. I think you may still have questions, more questions about these different terminologies. But as you learn more after we starting the transactions, I think you can get a better understanding. But in the beginning, I just build you some structure before we get on to the transactions. And now let's see the example we are going to use in this cost control module. In this module, we'll build 3 cost centers in the beginning. So 3 cost centers in the beginning, and each one represents a master data for a secondary cost element. So the name, for example, we have a department or cost center we call cafeteria. And under the managerial costing system, we design, create a secondary cost element. So 800 with your company code. And you can see this secondary cost element will help us track all of the direct cost and indirect cost happened for the cafeteria service. And in our example later, you will find out for the cafeteria, we have 2 primary cost elements. One is the labor expense, and the other one is, I think, a miscellaneous expense. So I maybe put a typo here. But the total direct cost incurred for the cafeteria is 90,000 labor expense and 60,000 miscellaneous expense. So the total cost of the cafe is 150,000. And for this 150,000, when we try to accumulate, we add the labor and the miscellaneous cost together, and this will be the secondary cost element for the cafeteria. Because later, when we needed to allocate the cafeteria service to all of the other departments, right? So this is the total cost we are going to allocate among the employees using the cafeteria service, or including the cafeteria employees themselves. So the 150,000 becomes a secondary cost element for allocation later. And later, when we do the transactions, you will see, we will assume, so we'll have 5 employees under the, So how we make allocation all in SAP, they call assessment of this 150,000 is depending on the number of the employees using the cafeteria service. So we have 5 employees in the cafeteria itself. Then the maintenance department has another 5 employees, and assemblies we have more, so 15 employees total. So when we try to design the assessment cycle, you can see this is from a math calculation is very simple. So you divide the 150,000 by total number of the employees will be 25, right? So you got a rate. And then the rate will apply to each of the department, like when we do the overhead allocation. So cafeteria will get 30,000, their own cost. The maintenance will be allocated for 30,000, and the assembly will be allocated for 90,000. So 30,000, 90,000, and they will have a 30,000 remaining cost under the cafeteria. No. So this procedure in SAP, they call assessment. So assessing the total cost for the cafe and allocate among the services receiving the cafeteria cost. Okay, assessment. So that's the first allocation module we are going to do. And then the second one, we have 2 other departments. They are, one is the maintenance, like internal maintenance, and the other one used for production purpose or assembly department. For maintenance is the internal service, and the primary cost element is only labor expense in our example. In real world, or you may have other type of primary cost, such as depreciations or maybe utility expenses. But see here, we are just simplifying. Have one more zero here. So the maintenance has its own 60,000 labor cost, and this is your primary cost element. Then we got allocated 30,000 from the cafeteria cost. Now for the cost center of the maintenance, which we use a secondary cost element. The secondary cost element is not a general ledger, but it will help us accumulate the total cost under the maintenance department. So it will be $90,000. Okay, be careful. Secondary cost element is for cost controlling purpose and is defined as a secondary cost element. Is not a general ledger account as I use for the labor cost here. So I don't really have the debit or credit, or is only a cost pool will accumulate the cost. Okay, so that's the maintenance. Then maintenance provides service to other departments, and later you will find out 1/3 of the maintenance cost is allocated to the assembly department, which is the production. And then 1/3 of this 90,000 will be 30,000, right? Based upon the labor hours. So later you see in the data, in the transactions, you see the activity levels. So total hours, I remember the total working hours of the maintenance is 1,800. That's by definition, like estimated the whole year. And the assembly department used 600 of their service hours. Allocation base, or is labor hours. So 1/3 of the 90,000 will be added or allocated to the assembly department. For assembly department, it has its own primary cost, which is the labor expense, 150,000. But it's got 2 indirect costs. So 90,000 allocated from the cafe, and then 30,000 allocated from the maintenance. So total cost incurred for the secondary cost elements of the assembly is 240,000, and this one will be transferred to the finished good later. So once the production is completed. So it's not going to other departments, but it's going to the finished good. Once that can be the cost of goods manufactured. If you remember how we define the cost flow in managerial accounting. So the secondary cost elements related to the assembly department is 820 visual accompanying code. So in the beginning of the controlling module, the first three steps will create a cost center for the cafe, and then another one for the maintenance, and then the assembly cost centers. So giving them their like the numerical value and define the other like controlling features. So after you create the master data, we'll create they call the statistical key figures. That one we use to allocate or assess the cafeteria cost based upon the employees. Then we create a allocation for the activity hours. Later, we can allocate the maintenance cost. Okay, so first 5 steps are master data. Okay, let me scroll. So when you see the transaction, the table of contents, the first 5 steps is our master data structure. Or like we already understand from the sales or procurement. We need a master data is like setting up your the data structure, right? So what database I need? So I need a cost center database, cost center tables. And I also need the statistical key figures for the employee allocation. Then secondary cost elements, and like the 8110, 820, and 800. The secondary cost elements will link to the related cost centers. Which is the same. So the numerical values of the secondary cost elements will be linked to their matching cost centers. And then create the activity type. Those are the working hours for the maintenance and assembly department. And then we'll create a cost center group, means putting all of the 3 cost centers together, the cafeteria, maintenance, and assembly. So later we can, simplify the assessment and allocation. Those are the only 3 cost centers we allocate the cafeteria cost and also your maintenance cost. Okay, so you don't need to list the cost centers individually, but every time you call this cost center group, they know they have the 3 cost centers individually to do the calculations. And the next 5 steps is to input the data. Okay, because those are the structure, like we design like the rows and columns for each of the tables. Now we enter the transaction data. How many employees you have? How many labor hours you incurred? And how much the labor cost, how much the miscellaneous cost for each of the 3 cost centers, and how many the activity hours. So before you actually run the allocation involving the assessment and the activity allocations. So the last 4 transactions is to create the actual assessment and the price calculation between the 2 other departments, and check and view our results can get the correct information. Okay, so this is a cost controlling module. And I will do the introduction here, and from the next video, we are going to start on the real transactions.